Right now, the United States and Iran are at war with each other. And what I expect to happen is that the United States will launch a ground invasion at some point. In fact, there are rumors that the 82nd Airborne Division has been deployed. They've canceled their training and they have received their deployment orders. Those are just rumors, not confirmed, but there's a lot of chatter, and we're going to expect a ground invasion at some point. I predict that this ground invasion will fail, which will lead to the collapse of the American empire. Basically, the United States will retreat from the Middle East, and CENTCOM, Central Command, will be absorbed into Israel. And so what will happen is then that Israel will achieve the Greater Israel Project. The Israelis believe that the Middle East was promised to their ancestor Abraham by Yahweh, their God. If you look at a map of the Greater Israel Project, it extends from the Nile to Euphrates. It encompasses Lebanon, Syria, parts of Turkey, parts of Saudi Arabia, and parts of Egypt, meaning that regardless of how this war in Iran progresses, Israel will continue to be aggressive. In fact, the former Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, has said that Turkey will be the new Iran, meaning that after this war against Iran is over, then Turkey will be the threat. And so we can expect that Israel will continue to be aggressive and eventually conquer most of the Middle East once this war in Iran concludes. And then Israel will establish something called a Pax Judaica. The Pax Judaica is really the empire, a trading empire, a financial empire, a technological empire based in Jerusalem. And they see it as fulfillment of biblical prophecy. They want to rebuild Solomon's temple. That means that they will at some point destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. In fact, there are rumors that the Israelis have shut down the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And right now, they are, and again, these are just rumors, not confirmed, but people suspect that the Israelis are implanting explosives for controlled demolition so that they can blame a Iranian missile on the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which, as we know, is the third holiest site in all of Islam. In fact, on YouTube, there's a rabbi who talks about this plan. He says that wouldn't it be wonderful if during a war, an Iranian missile hit the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Arabs and the Persians would go fight each other, and those animals would kill each other. Those are his literal words. So we can also expect at some point that the Al-Aqsa Mosque will be destroyed. So that's how I see this war in the Middle East progressing in the next 4 or 5 years.
Well, there is an eschatological flurry, a blizzard, a hail coming like missiles everywhere. America seems to be in the grip of a kind of Old Testament frenzy. And even American officials are talking in these apocalyptic terms, hurrying on Armageddon, explicitly stating that killing Iranians will hurry up the return of Jesus to the world. Scientific men like you and I probably don't have to spend too much time on this eschatology, but let's talk about what it would mean in practice. Netanyahu spoke this very day about a major surprise that he has coming for the Iranians, which he said will completely destabilize the country. Now, I mean, it's thinly veiled. I mean, there's not exactly a burqa on the meaning of that. It means either ground invasion or a resort to nuclear weapons. Let's start with the second hypothesis first. What would it mean if Israel launched a nuclear weapon at Iran?
Right. So the strategy is to use a tactical nuclear weapon against Iran's underground missile cities, missile bases. Right now, American airstrikes, Israeli airstrikes, cannot penetrate underground and destroy the capacity of the Iranians to fire ballistic missiles and drones at the GCC and at Israel. And what experts say is that a tactical nuclear strike will not destroy these cities, will not destroy these bases, but they will seal off the entrances and make them inhabitable, make them useless, basically. So a tactical nuclear strike is definitely part of the military strategies of the Israelis and Americans. I personally do not believe this is likely. And there are certain reasons why I am not that convinced that they will in fact use a tactical nuclear bomb. The first reason is just military doctrine, where militaries tend to be bureaucracies, very strict chain of command. And in order for the military bureaucracy to function, you need a strict military doctrine, an understanding of how to fight a war. Now, Israel has something called a exemption option. The idea is that if the very existence of Israel is threatened at any point, then Israel will launch all its nuclear arsenal, and it could be, and people argue about how many nukes it has, like 90 to 300, okay? But Israel would launch these nuclear weapons and nuke all the world cities, okay? And this is called exemption option, where Israel is not retaliating, but Israel is just destroying the world. So in other words, Israel has a strategic nuclear arsenal and not a tactical nuclear arsenal. And it's actually not that easy to transfer from a strategic nuclear arsenal into a tactical nuclear arsenal. So that's one major limitation to this idea. The second thing is that we assume that the Israelis and Americans are going to go into Iran and they want to win this war, whatever winning means for them. They have not actually defined what meaning means. But, you know, if we look at eschatology, if we think that, in fact, that Israel and America are conducting this war in order to bring about the return of Jesus, which is what many American soldiers believe, then the eschatology requires America to lose this war. Because if America were to lose this war, then Israel would emerge as a dominant nation in the Middle East. So Israel doesn't need to beat Iran. Israel just needs America and Iran to destroy each other. And so for that to happen, you would want a ground invasion. So Israel wants to position America so that it is forced into a ground invasion. So I think a much more reasonable option would be to send in limited ground troops, perhaps the 82nd Airborne Division to try to capture a nuclear site, to decapitate Tehran. I'm not quite sure what they have in mind. But again, I'm not actually, I am not at all convinced that a nuclear option is on the table. And the third problem is Russia. So the Washington Post has reported that Russia is providing targeting intelligence to the Iranians, which is exactly what US and NATO did in Ukraine against Russia. So it's almost like payback for Ukraine. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, has said that Russia considers Iran an indispensable ally. So I think that backdoors, Russia and Putin have told the Americans and the Israelis to watch it, like don't go too far. Don't move too fast up the escalation ladder. And at some point, I predict that Putin will put Iran under the Russian nuclear umbrella, meaning that any nuclear weapon used in Iran will be considered a direct attack against Russia, and Russia will respond accordingly.
Well, you'll have successfully chilled the blood of most of the audience, Professor, and that's, of course, inevitable given the gravity of your message. So let's look at that first hypothesis then. No nuclear attack, but a ground attack. Now, Iran is 93 million people, The American intelligence agencies themselves are reporting that no significant breach exists in Iran. The much vaunted liberal classes, pro-American liberal classes in Iran are really limited to the vestibule, the foyer of the Intercontinental Hotel in Tehran. And in any case, according to the propaganda, thousands of those were killed by the Iranian government's forces only a couple of months ago. So we may surmise that the Iranian people are, to a very significant extent, united in the face of this enormous aggression. So you drop by parachute the 82nd Airborne into a 93 million population with a mountainous and vast territory. What happens next?
Right. So I don't think that they will actually do that either, because as you point out, parachuting any amount of soldiers into the middle of Iran is just pure suicide. They are bound to be either killed or captured in the process, which would be completely humiliating for Trump and Netanyahu. You're absolutely right in that Iran is much more unified than ever before. So in June, there was a 12-day war. And in the first few days, Israel was very successful in decapitating the regime. A lot of generals, a lot of scientists, a lot of high officials of the Iranian government were being targeted and were being killed. But that attack expended a lot of Israeli resources in terrain. They had spent years developing intelligence, human intelligence networks that were uncovered because of this 12-day war. Also, because of the indiscriminate killing during the 12-day war, the Iranians struck back hard against Israelis, and it really unified the people. The Iranian government was much more resilient and much more resolved than the Israelis predicted. They actually believed that airstrike decapitation would basically destroy the government, as though it were a house of cards. You fast forward to January, where there were these mass protests across the country, and we know that this is a part of the classic color revolution playbook, where Mossad agents were embedded among the protesters. Many of these protesters were paid agents and saboteurs developed by the Israeli over the number of years. But the Iranians were able to close out the internet and jam Starlink and discover these cells. So another way of saying this is that the Israelis had spent years in building up networks throughout Iran that they could use for this war. But because of the 12-day war and because of January protests, these networks have been destroyed, so that the government in Iran is much more unified, much more coherent than ever before. And that presents a problem for ground invasion, because it is the American military doctrine to use as many proxies as possible. Now, a few days ago, there was talk of the Americans bring the Kurds into the war from Iraq. There's also talk of bringing the Sunni ISIS insurgents from Iraq into the war. And as of today, we've discovered that the Kurds have refused this American offer to join the war. And if America were to launch a ground invasion, it would have to do so by itself. And quite honestly, I would not know how it would actually launch the ground invasion. For a ground invasion to work properly, they need to mass forces. That means bringing at least 500,000 soldiers into the Middle East and preparing them for a full-scale ground invasion through either Pakistan or through Iraq. And right now, the GCC countries are being bombarded by drones and ballistic missiles. And so it'd be very hard for troops to be prepared and to be staged properly. So the ground invasion is part of a plan, but I don't really know the specifics of how they would accomplish such a ground invasion.
And of course, Pakistan, showing all the signs of being more likely to intervene if they intervened on the side of Iran rather than on the side of the United States, certainly if you judged by their rhetoric. Now, Professor, we already know, despite the censorship and self-censorship involved, that this is not a one-sided war, that the Iranian ballistic, hypersonic, and even drone response is taking a severe toll on cities like Tel Aviv and Haifa. What do you estimate? How would you calibrate the level of damage on the Israeli side?
Right. So the main lesson that the Israelis learned from the 12-Day War is to censor its own people, to make sure that this footage of destruction will not come out and be made public around the world. So I think that Israel is far more resilient than people believe. Yes, a lot of people are leaving Israel. Yes, the Iranians are doing a lot of damage, but the Israelis are an eschatological people. They really do believe that this is the end times. And they have been extremely fanatical ever since October 7th. So I think that the Israeli people themselves are much more unified, much more determined than people assume, even though I assume that the damage to Tel Aviv is just vast. The real issue are the GCC countries. The GCC countries are actually vulnerable, much more vulnerable than people previously imagined. So the GCC countries before thought that, we are neutral, we are Muslim. So if there's a war to break out between Iran and Israel, then we'll be neutral and Iran will leave us alone. The problem is that Iran recognizes that if America attacks us, then we need to be able to defend ourselves. And the American military is ultimately supported by the GCC countries because it's the GCC countries that pay for the weapon systems that house American soldiers and that allow American Air Force to use its airspace to strike Iran. So the Iranians are very smart in that the first two things that they did after the war started was, one, de facto close off the Strait of Hormuz, thus strangling the global economy, and then launching drone strikes against the GCC nations. Now, these drone strikes are actually controversial, and there's a lot of debate about them. So, for example, at first it was reported that the Iranians used a drone to hit a Saudi Aramco oil facility, thus damaging the energy infrastructure of Saudi Arabia. And that's grounds for a declaration of war. But later it was reported that actually this drone came from the west in Lebanon rather than from the east. And the Iranians actually denied this, saying that we want to protect our oil facilities just as much as you want to protect your oil facilities. So why would we give you a reason to come attack our oil facilities, right? We're better off attacking U.S. bases. We're better off attacking the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. We won't waste our precious ammunition targeting oil fields. And also, Tucker Carlson on his show told us that he was told by the Qataris that they had arrested 2 Mossad agents suspected of infiltrating Qatar in order to commit false flag sabotage operations. And the Qataris have denied this report, but we can suspect that this is true because it really is the Mossad MO. So the GCC nations are the ones that are in real trouble because of this war, not only because the Iranians want to destroy the American military's capacity to supply ammunition, but also because the Israelis want to drag the GCC nations into this war and create a regional conflagration, especially Saudi Arabia. Because remember, in the Greater Israel Project scheme, eventually Israel needs to take on Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey. So why not just drag Saudi Arabia into this war and have Iran destroy Saudi Arabia in order to lessen the conflict later on?
And yet, Professor, it's raining oil in Tehran today, and I dare say also in Haifa, because for the first time in the war, and it's a war that's lasted a whole week, which is a long time by today's standards. The oil depots of Iran were apparently completely destroyed, and the streets, the very streets of Tehran, are on fire. In retaliation, the major oil depots for Israel in the city of Haifa have been struck and are also on fire. So we're now in for a tit for tat on destroying oil production. In those circumstances, with oil heading for $150 a barrel, maybe even $200 a barrel, ineluctably, if there are more attacks on Iran's oil infrastructure, the Iranians will strike the Arabian side of the Persian Gulf to create not $200 a barrel, but no price per barrel at all. You'd be putting a barrel of oil in the Louvre.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're seeing is the escalation ladder climbing, right? So at first, I think all sides decided to focus on military targets. And now what they're doing is they're switching to soft targets that do economic damage. So the Americans struck a desalination plant in Iran. And so now thousands of Iranians will not have access to fresh water. And the Iranians responded by targeting a desalination plant in Bahrain, okay? So we have to understand that this is now total war, meaning that to destroy each other, they need to destroy each other's economies. And this marks a new world. We can't possibly return to the old world where you could access energy for cheap. In the future, and I'm talking about maybe in a year or two, every nation will have to engage in massive deindustrialization because they can no longer access cheap oil. More and more nations will start to engage in mercantilism, and they need to create their own self-sufficient supply chains. And the nation that is in most dire need right now is actually Japan, because Japan is an extremely wealthy country, but it's completely dependent on global supply chains. It receives about 75% of its oil from the Strait of Hormuz. And Prime Minister Takaichi, in a speech, said that in 7 to 8 months, Japan will run out of oil and energy, thus threatening its entire economy. So the ultimate reverberations, the consequences of what's happening will be felt only a few weeks from now. But we should expect a massive global depression to appear on the horizon very soon. And basically, the old world order of global trade is dead, and it will never return in our lifetimes. That's the reality we're facing right now.
Now, as Sherlock Holmes might put it, the shoe that hasn't dropped in your discourse thus far is China. China has strategic relations with Iran. In fact, the Strait of Hormuz is not closed, but it is gated. And the Chinese oil tankers are, of course, being allowed through the gate. China is a global superpower, the greatest manufacturing power on the earth. So in deindustrializing West, China's industrial power would see it through. But that's, of course, an invitation for war to be waged against China. Many people believe that the attack on Iran, indeed even the attack on Russia through Ukraine, are mere precursors from the real Armageddon, if I can put it that way, a US-China conflict. How do you feel about that?
I think over the next 2 months, 2 to 3 months, people's understanding of China, people's understanding of how the world works will radically shift. At the end of this month, Trump is scheduled for a state visit to Beijing. And this is his first state visit in his second term. And I don't think a sitting American president has visited China in the past 8 years. So this is a very big deal. And in fact, this meeting at the end of the month is just one of 3 planned meetings this year. And the reason why this is happening is that China and America plan a rapprochement. They plan a grand bargain to reset the international order. And the reason why is that there are 2 nations that have benefited the most from globalization. They are the United States and they are China. They are symbiotic. They are codependent. So America has its market and China has a manufacturing export economy. And China doesn't have a domestic consumer base. So China is completely reliant on exports, and it imports resources, as primarily energy and food, in order to feed its manufacturing base. So it is in China's best interest to come to an arrangement with America as soon as possible. And even though you could make the argument that Trump's actions in Venezuela, Trump's actions in Iran are to strangle the Chinese economy, I think that we can test this hypothesis in a month or 2 when Trump and Xi meet and come to a grand bargain. I think people, again, will be surprised and shocked by what will happen. It is entirely possible that China agrees to buy American oil rather than Iranian oil. It is entirely, right now, China imports a lot of energy needs from the Middle East, Qatar especially. And this war in the Middle East, it's not going to go away, and China needs to meet its energy needs. China imports 75% of its oil, and 60% of its energy supply comes from the Middle East. So I would not be surprised if Trump and China were to come to an agreement where China becomes America's energy consumer.
Now, let's go back to the original for the last question, Professor, and I'm grateful for your time. Is there an off-ramp anywhere that can stop this catastrophe, that can stop this hurtling towards the end of times in the Middle East? Could Trump declare victory in some bogus way and pack it up?
So we are in a situation because the United States presented Iran with 3 impossible demands. These 3 impossible demands are 0 uranium enrichment, even for civilian purposes, to abandon its proxies in the Middle East, the Houthis, Hezbollah, the Shia militias in Iraq, Hamas, and to end or drastically reduce its ballistic missiles program. Okay, so these are 3 impossible demands, because basically what America says is that if you give up the right to defend yourself, we might not attack you. Oh, and by the way, we're not going to lift sanctions. So we're still going to strangle you economically, but we might be nice to you if you accede to our demands. So these are impossible demands. And it was clear at that point that the Americans were looking for a pretext to attack Iran. Trump's envoys in these negotiations were Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. And these are 2 ardent Zionists who are close to Netanyahu. And we all know that Netanyahu wanted war. Steve Witkoff, during the negotiations, went on TV and said that, oh, the Iranians are like 1 or 2 weeks away from weapons-grade uranium arrangement, basically saying that the Iranians are negotiating in bad faith, okay? So the Americans did everything possible to make sure that the Iranians could not agree to peace, and they were just looking for a pretext for war. Nonetheless, a few hours before the Israelis actually attacked Iran, the Omani foreign minister, the Omanis were the ones who were mediating the negotiations, went on TV and said that the Iranians had compromised. The Iranians had agreed to 0 uranium enrichment, even for civilian purposes, which before was a red line. And he also said that the Iranians were willing to negotiate with regard to their proxies as well as to their ballistic missiles program. And then what happened a few hours later? Well, the Americans and the Israelis killed their supreme leader. Okay? So another way of saying this is that for whatever reason, and we can argue about what the reasons are. The Americans and the Israelis are intent on war. And the reason why they have not articulated a strategy and a reason and a purpose is they want to maintain maximum flexibility, which means that they want to destroy Iran's capacity to be a nation state. They want to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age. They want to divide Iran into ethnic enclaves that will be divided and ruled by Israel. And that's the ultimate purpose of this war. That's why the Americans are now targeting desalination plants. And that's why they're targeting Iran's energy infrastructure, right? So from the American perspective, they want to destroy Iran. And the Iranians recognize this. And that's why the Iranians have said that we will fight to the bitter end. So yeah, so maybe there will be some mediation. Maybe the GCC nations, maybe others like China will try to help negotiate a peace. But for whatever reason, the Americans are set on the destruction of Iran.